The sands of time are running out. 3, 2, 1.
Global birth rates are plummeting everywhere. And I mean like everywhere you look.
Oh, absolutely. It's happening globally.
Right. And if you look at the news, secular scientists are just panicking. They're blaming everything from, microplastics to economics or just modern stress.
Yeah, they're definitely scrambling for horizontal answers.
But what if the data is actually pointing to something completely different? What if it's a massive, terrifying biological countdown? I mean, what if the human species isn't slowly dying out because of pollution, but is simply, running out of souls?
It is a totally paradigm-shifting concept.
It really is. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are looking at something that, quite frankly, completely shatters how we perceive time, history, and biology.
Yeah, we are unpacking a truly massive dossier today. We're looking at Jim Wize's Countdown to Zero framework, specifically version 50.
Version 50, right.
And, this isn't just some casual philosophical text. It is a highly intricate, exhaustively detailed jurisprudential analysis of the final era of human history.
It's incredibly dense.
It is. We have a mountain of source material to get through today. That includes these complex schematic slides that map out what Wize calls the sovereign architecture and the forensic redemption blueprint.
Okay, so the mission for this deep dive is to really walk sequentially through Wize's arguments. We are going to explore the literal biological mechanics of how human history is physically rolling backward.
Exactly.
We're going to look at the silent, creeping shutdown of the human wound on this current Earth. And ultimately, we were going to trace how this precise courtroom logic leads into the transition to a boundless, deathless ecosystem, which the text calls the renewed Earth.
It's a massive journey.
So if you're listening to this, prepare yourself. We are going to completely dismantle the idea of history as just some random, open-ended sequence of events.
To really grasp this, we have to start by completely redefining how we view time. I mean, usually we picture the timeline of human history as an endless, open road just stretching out over the horizon.
Right, like an assumption of infinity. We just assume it goes on forever.
Exactly. But Wize argues that time is not an open-ended biological loop. It is a closed database.
A closed database.
Yes. He calls this the strict bookkeeping of the eternal destino framework. The foundational premise here is that there is a fixed, unalterable, mathematically precise number of authorized true human souls.
Okay, hold on. Let me just wrap my head around that for a second. A fixed number of souls.
Yeah.
So you're saying time itself isn't just, the ticking of a clock on a wall. Time is a finite resource. It is a literal ledger ticking down to absolute zero.
That's the exact framework, yes.
So if the master database only has, say, 20 billion names in it, once those names are processed, the system just stops.
Precisely. It stops. And to explain the mechanics of how the system processes those names at the very end, Wize points us to a specific scriptural precedent.
Okay.
He looks at the parable of the workers in the vineyard. This is found in Matthew chapter 20.
Right, the vineyard parable.
In this parable, human history is represented as a single working day. You have a landowner, which represents King Jesus, the ultimate sovereign who purchased the entire physical plane with his own blood.
Makes sense.
And this landowner goes out at different hours of the day to hire workers for his vineyard.
So these different groups of workers, they represent the successive eras of humanity, right?
Exactly.
You've got the first hour workers, the third hour, the sixth hour, all the way down to the 11th hour workers who are hired right at the tail end of the day.
Yes, and that is a great metaphor for history. But Wize argues it's far more than just a metaphor.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The critical mechanism is the payoff sequence. When the day ends, the landowner issues a very specific, deliberate command. He says, call the laborers and give them their wages, beginning with the last to the first.
Okay, wait. Beginning with the last to the first.
Yes.
So Wize is taking that literally. He's saying this isn't just a moral lesson about, everyone getting the same amount of grace regardless of when they showed up.
No, not at all.
He is arguing this is a literal legal description of how the final era of history physically operates. It's a reverse chronological rollback.
That is exactly what he's arguing. When this final era begins, God executes this payoff sequence physically.
Wow.
So the 11th hour workers, the most recent generations in history, they're dealt with first. Then the timeline systematically rolls backward.
It winds backward through the eras.
Right. It winds back through the successive eras. The generations who lived before Jesus was born, then moving further back to those who lived prior to the flood all the way back to the very first hour workers.
Which would be our first parents, Adam and Eve.
Exactly. Adam and Eve.
They are the ones refleshed at the absolute tail end of this sequence. I mean, Wize maps this out mathematically in his framework, right?
He does. And if you look at the human history reverse rollback slide.
Oh, yeah, I have that slide right here.
Yeah, specifically focus on the finite soul ledger visual there. It shows the timeline winding backward to a point labeled midnight, the birth of Adam.
Right, I see that. So you picture a massive timeline. It isn't marching forward into the unknown, it is marching backward. From the most recent generations, winding down toward this massive clock face.
Exactly.
Wait, slow down. You're kind of losing me on the logistics here.
Okay, sure.
If history is rolling backward, and these historical souls are being brought back to the current Earth to be, like, judged or tested,
Yeah.
how exactly is that happening? Are they just materializing out of thin air?
No. And that is a really crucial distinction to make here. God doesn't just instantly materialize billions of spirits onto the terrestrial plane.
That would be chaotic.
It would plunge the physical structure of the world into complete immediacy. It would be this apocalyptic ghost town scenario. It wouldn't work.
Right.
Instead, God utilizes the natural, ordered process of biology. Returning spirits inherit the exact DNA and physical features of their biological lineages.
Oh, so the biological womb is the mechanism.
Yes, exactly. The womb is a highly structured sequential filter used to reflesh these historical spirits onto the current Earth.
Okay, so the womb is essentially the sieve that pulls souls from the spiritual holding area and places them into physical bodies.
Exactly.
But, and here's my pushback, if the timeline is rolling backward, and that database of historical souls is finite, like you said,
Yes.
doesn't that mean we are literally running out of biological runway? I mean, every time a baby is born on this current Earth, a name is crossed off that finite ledger.
That is precisely the bottleneck.
Wow.
As this reverse rollback progresses backward toward the very beginning of the timeline, the remaining pool of historical souls sitting in the spiritual repository is being rapidly depleted.
So let's take this to its logical conclusion then. As we approach the very bottom of that list, as we get closer and closer to Adam and Eve, what happens biologically on the ground?
What happens is a massive, unprecedented mathematical disparity.
Okay.
Wize introduces the concept of the womb-to-soul ratio. As the rollback approaches its terminal limits, a radical asymmetry develops between the physical capacity to have children and the spiritual authorization to actually birth a true human soul.
Let me see if I have this straight. Let's look at the physical side of this equation first.
Sure.
Wize talks a lot about what he calls the host line.
Right, the host line.
These are the unregenerate physical survivors of the millennium who have basically served as the mortal reproductive pipeline. Over centuries, they have multiplied exponentially.
They have. This unindwelt host line has populated the current Earth in massive numbers.
Yep.
So because of this exponential multiplication, there is a global surplus of physical womb capacity. The biological hardware is structurally perfect.
But on the other side of the equation, you have the spiritual software, the authorization.
Yes.
Because the rollback is working backward through that finite ledger, the repository of historical souls is running dry.
Exactly.
And historically speaking, the earliest eras of humanity, like the ones prior to the flood, they had much smaller populations compared to the billions who lived later.
Oh, absolutely. So as the biological funnel reaches those ancient morning hours of history, the pool of authorized spirits shrinks to just a razor-thin margin.
Wow.
And Wize illustrates this brilliantly on that same reverse rollback slide.
Right, the gauge is on the slide.
Yeah, if you picture a gauge tracking physical womb capacity, the needle is completely pinned in the green. It's a global surplus, structurally perfect.
Right.
But the spiritual gauge right next to it, tracking the authorized spirit pool,
Yeah.
buried in the red, terminally exhausted, rapidly depleting.
This creates what Wize calls the silent, creeping shutdown.
Yes.
And I think this is where the genius of his framework really shines, because it explains the mechanism without resorting to, Hollywood disaster tropes.
Exactly.
When the birth rate starts to plummet globally, it is not due to a mechanical biological failure, is it?
No, not at all. It is not a sudden realm-wide medical outbreak of physical infertility. It isn't a genetic mutation that suddenly renders humanity sterile. The wombs of the host line remain structurally perfect. They are entirely capable of conception.
It's like a state-of-the-art printing press.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, imagine you have this massive warehouse filled with thousands of perfectly oiled high-tech printing presses. You have unlimited ink. You have mountains of paper stacked all the way up to the ceiling.
Right.
The machines are spinning flawlessly, belts are humming, everything is in perfect working order. But the author's manuscript has simply ended.
Yes.
Nothing prints, not because the machines are broken, but because there's simply no more words to pull from the master file. The hardware is totally fine. The data stream is empty.
That is a perfect analogy. Because the historical dead have been fully exhausted, there are simply 0 human spirits remaining in the holding cells that are authorized by the sovereign's ledger to enter those womb filters.
So the birth rate just plummets towards 0 purely by sovereign decree.
Exactly. The pipeline is fast closed because there are no more names left to print.
But here's where this really hits reality for me. Humans are incredibly data-driven. We have demographers, sociologists, government agencies tracking every single birth and death.
Oh, we track everything.
So if this silent shutdown is happening right now, how are secular scientists reacting to it? Are they seeing this mathematical disparity?
Oh, they are absolutely seeing it. Secular analysts have been tracking this reduction in birth rates for a long time now.
They have.
You look at populations in South Korea, Japan, across Europe, and increasingly in the Americas, I mean, the macro demographic data is impossible to hide.
Right, it's everywhere.
The numbers are undeniably shrinking towards 0. It is a Socratic reality playing out right in front of the world's data analysts. But what is fascinating is the historical anomaly that Wize points out.
Okay.
And this is something that the secular data perfectly corroborates.
Are you talking about the massive baby boom from 60 to 80 years ago?
Yes, exactly that. Around the mid-20th century, there was a phenomenal high-frequency birth boom across the world. Now, from the perspective of secular history, this is usually attributed to post-war economics and, global optimism. But from the perspective of the eternal destiny framework, that boom makes perfect mathematical sense.
Because 60 to 80 years ago, the sequential womb pipeline was processing the heavily populated later historical eras.
Yes.
The 11th hour and 10th hour workers, basically. The ledger was absolutely packed with names. So millions of authorized spirits were being filtered back onto the current Earth simultaneously.
Exactly. But as the rollback progresses backward, it leaves those heavily populated eras behind. It enters the sparsely populated ancient morning hours of history.
Prior to the flood.
Yes, it hits the generations prior to the flood. And because that remaining pool of authorized spirits is exponentially smaller, the global birth rate doesn't just slowly decline.
It plunges into a vertical cliff.
Yes, a vertical cliff.
Okay, I have to jump in here with some skepticism, though.
Right.
Because secular scientists have been tracking this decline for a long time.
They have.
But they usually have entirely different explanations for it. They point to economics, the prohibitive cost of raising children, the shifting priorities of modern life, microplastics lowering fertility rates, modern stress. I mean, why wouldn't just be those horizontal earthly factors?
And that is the absolute crux of the secular blind spot.
Okay.
Wize argues that without the guidance of the Holy Spirit to unseal their cognitive hardware, secular analysts can only look at horizontal numbers.
Right.
And they try to find a horizontal cause. They see the physical evidence of the rollback, the plunging birth rates, but they fundamentally misinterpret the data.
So they think they are just watching the random biological collapse of a species due to environmental or social pressures.
Yes. Yeah.
But Wise's framework says they're actually watching a sovereign judicial act. They are watching the ledger physically run out.
Correct. The numbers are undeniable chronological signatures that the timeline is winding back to the absolute beginning.
Which raises a terrifying question, if you think about it.
What's up?
If secular authorities are misinterpreting this data, is it just an innocent mistake? I mean, are they just applying the wrong scientific model? Or is there an active, coordinated effort to keep people looking horizontally so they don't realize the sovereign clock is ticking down?
If we look at the broader scope of Wise's framework, it is absolutely not an innocent mistake.
Really?
No. This brings us to the reaction of the unrepentant corporate hive mind, what Wize refers to as Satan and his hosts. And we really have to understand their specific vulnerability here.
Well, Wize describes this adversary not as some cartoonish villain with a pitchfork, but as an incredibly intelligent, highly synchronized corporate collective mind.
Yes.
And they are actively running demographic and biological surveillance.
Right. They are, because they know the scriptures better than anyone, and they understand the legalities of the rollback.
Right.
Their data analysts detect the shrinking plane-wide population. They know that this birth line is winding back toward our first parents.
So they know the hourglass is almost out of sand. Their lease on this current Earth is exceptionally short.
Yes, and this realization induces an absolute system-wide panic within the demonic host.
A panic.
Yes, and the reason for this panic is purely biological. The materialized flesh suits or vessels they operate within are completely sterile. They are physically incapable of natural reproduction. They rely entirely on the human biological pipeline to provide the vessels for their containment grid and their societal structure.
Okay, let me process that. They are sterile parasites, essentially.
Exactly.
They need the human womb pipeline to generate the physical bodies they require to maintain their illusion of control. So as the human womb pipeline closes,
their entire system starts to collapse.
Wow. They are physically trapped on a shrinking demographic island.
Exactly. If you look at the post-millennial Little Seasons slide, it illustrates this perfectly. It shows this hostile environment and the temporary release of the adversary to test the populations. The testing ground of this final era becomes an environment of escalating fury and defensive hostility. They have to cover up the fact that the pipeline is shutting down, because if the remaining human population realizes the biological end is here, they might wake up to the sovereign reality of God's judgment.
So they initiate a massive, fragmented matrix of cover-ups.
They do.
And Wize makes a highly controversial claim here about how they execute this. And just to be completely clear for you listening, we are strictly looking at Wize's framework and how he interprets this. We aren't endorsing any specific political or social conspiracy theories regarding pollution or whatever, but he discusses what he calls the symmetrical excuse.
Yes, the symmetrical excuse. Wize states that the controllers are actively poisoning the air, food, water, and pumping in chemicals and microplastics.
Okay.
But he argues that the ultimate deception is that the adversary actually uses their own environmental poisoning campaigns as a decoy.
A decoy. So they intentionally pollute the environment, not just to cause harm, but to create a highly visible scapegoat. When the birth rates plummet because the soul ledger is empty, they point the public's attention exclusively to the microplastics and the toxins and say, look, this is why people can't have babies. It's the pollution.
That is the core of his argument regarding the symmetrical excuse. By medicalizing the slowdown, by framing it as a tragic environmental failure, they hide the sovereign clock.
It's all horizontal.
Exactly. They ensure the masses remain entirely focused on physical, horizontal causes, completely blind to the fact that it's actually God deactivating the womb filter.
It's a sleight of hand. Look at the plastic in the water, don't look at the divine ledger.
Oh, exactly.
But that can't be their only trick. Because if the population is shrinking as drastically as Wize suggests, you can't just blame microplastics forever.
No, you can't.
Eventually, people are going to notice that entire towns are emptying out. How do they maintain the illusion that the world is still bustling and full?
They utilize what Wize calls urban camouflage.
Urban camouflage.
Yes. As the vast breadth of the current Earth quietly hollows out due to the lack of births, the adversary systematically herds and forces the surviving populations into hyper-dense megacities.
Oh, wow.
They execute massive demographic relocations, pulling adults from the rural outer lands into tightly packed urban centers.
Ah, so it's like a failing retail corporation that's secretly going bankrupt.
Okay, yeah.
Imagine a company has 50 massive flagship stores across the country, but 49 of them are completely empty. No customers, no inventory. Instead of admitting failure, they pack all their remaining employees, all their remaining merchandise, and all their remaining customers into one tiny central store in the middle of a major city.
Right.
They make it look incredibly bustling, chaotic, and overcrowded to the shareholders, hoping they won't notice that all the other buildings have been quietly boarded up and abandoned.
That is exactly the psychological mechanism at play. When people are staring at packed city grids, sky-high rent prices, and endless traffic jams, their minds easily buy into the false narrative of overpopulation.
Right, because they feel crowded.
Exactly. They are completely distracted by the horizontal crowding. They feel like the world is bursting at the seams, completely unaware that the vertical reproductive corridor has been fast closed.
It's terrifyingly brilliant.
Yeah.
And Wize also mentions faked pregnancies and highly managed surrogacy programs to simulate normal human progression. Right.
He does.
And then for people who aren't swayed by the environmental or scientific excuses, they deploy fragmented theological deceptions.
Yes, the adversary deploys multiple concurrent scenarios to trap different mindsets. For the scientifically minded, it's the mutation or environmental lie. Some are fed a cosmic simulation-alleged theory.
Okay.
But for the religiously inclined, state-sanctioned teachers pivot to a narrative of dark theological terror, the angry God narrative.
Right. They claim that God is an arbitrary, emotional tyrant who just shut off the wombs in a fit of rage because he is disgusted with humanity.
Yes.
Which is such a convenient lie for the adversary because it completely ignores the beautiful mathematical perfection of the ledger simply being completed.
Precisely. It paints God as erratic rather than meticulously just.
Yeah.
But this massive system-wide matrix of cover-ups raises a really profound jurisprudential question.
Let's see. If the world is filled with this unprecedented level of deception, and every single historical soul is being brought back to be tested in this specific environment, how is that fair?
Right?
I mean, how does God ensure a fair trial when the world is practically engineered to lie to you?
That brings us to one of the most vital legal mechanisms in Wise's entire framework. He calls it the memory seal, or the law of complete forgetfulness.
Okay, let's unpack that.
God utilizes this memory seal to provide a perfectly judicial, clean slate. If you look at the sequential womb filtering slide,
Yep, I have it.
notice step 3 is highlighted as memory seal. When a historical spirit is refleshed through the womb filter onto the current Earth, their prior historical memories are completely sealed under a divine firewall.
Okay.
They wake up as a baby, grow up, and experience the world with zero conscious memory of who they were in their past life.
Wait, slow down. You're losing me a little bit here.
Okay, sure.
If God is just wiping everyone's memories clean, how is that a fair trial? Isn't he effectively testing a totally different person?
That's a common initial thought.
I mean, if I don't remember my past mistakes, I can't learn from them. Why would a perfectly just judge wipe the evidence of who I was? Wize gives 3 very specific legal reasons for this, right?
He does, and the first reason addresses your exact concern about fairness.
Okay.
The primary reason for the memory seal is to shatter the deception of walking by sight.
Walking by sight.
Yes. Consider this. If returning spirits, whether they were ancient prophets who spoke directly to angels or pagan kings who witnessed divine judgment, stood on the current Earth with their memories perfectly intact, they would possess direct empirical knowledge of the spiritual realm.
Oh, right. If you actually remembered standing before the Creator or experiencing the literal reality of physical death and the afterlife in a past life, your faith wouldn't be faith anymore. You wouldn't be choosing God out of love or trust. Your choice would be forced by sheer overwhelming terror and absolute empirical proof.
True faith cannot be mechanically coerced. It must be chosen voluntarily through personal inward surrender. By erasing the cognitive memory slate, God resets the playing field.
He ensures that faith remains a pure, Socratic choice of the heart, rather than an automated reaction to overwhelming evidence. You had to seek him in the dark, so to speak.
Exactly. It preserves free will.
That actually makes total sense.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the second reason?
The second reason is to enforce absolute impartiality. This is mandated in Acts 10.34, which states that God shows no partiality.
So it levels the playing field between the powerful and the weak.
Entirely. Imagine if certain spirits entered this final trial with the cognitive advantage of ancient wisdom, centuries of accumulated knowledge, or first-hand memories of historical events.
They'd have a huge head start.
They would possess a massive, unequal rigged advantage over someone who died young in a previous era.
Right.
By ensuring that every single Adamic spirit, from the greatest ancient king to the lowest peasant, enters the terrestrial plane under the exact same condition of a clean biological slate, God maintains perfect impartiality in his courtroom.
So it's a completely blind taste test for the soul.
Yes.
God strips away the historical labels, the royal titles, the ancient traumas. You aren't judged on who you were socially or politically, but on the pure, organic posture of your heart right now.
Exactly. Which naturally ties into the third reason for the seal.
Which is?
The absolute erasure of trauma and ancient pride. If memories weren't sealed, the fragile human mind would collapse under the psychological weight of past life traumas, violent deaths, or conversely, the self-exalting pride of ancient royal lineages.
Yeah, nobody could function carrying centuries of baggage.
God mercifully liberates the spirit from the crushing baggage of the old creation's history so they can genuinely focus on the present trial.
But this brings me back to my earlier pushback.
Yeah.
If all my memories are wiped, am I even the same person? How does this trial actually reflect my true nature if my conscious mind is a blank slate?
This is where Wize introduces the principle of spiritual continuity.
Spiritual continuity, okay.
While the physical brain and the natural conscious memories are completely sealed, the core alignment, the orientation, and the default posture of the human spirit remain unbroken across eras.
Wait, really?
Yes, a soul does not experience a fundamental mutation just because its environment or biological costume changes.
Let me try to put this in concrete terms. Are you saying that if I was a notoriously proud, self-reliant ancient king who demanded worship back in Babylon, and I'm refleshed today as a mid-level accountant or a middle manager, because my spiritual core is the exact same, I'm still going to be demanding absolute subservience in the boardroom?
Yes.
The costume changed, the memories are gone, but the soul is identical.
That is precisely what spiritual continuity means. The unrepentant lost remain lost because it is their own persistent, unbroken self-will to stand upon the ledger of their own works.
Oh, wow.
In their past lives, they refused unmerited grace. When they are refleshed today, even without their memories, they look upon that exact same grace, they grumble against it, and they actively choose to rely on their independent strength.
So the organic posture of their spirit hasn't changed one iota.
Not at all. And the opposite is true for the saved.
Right. Those who walked in reliant, humble faith back there in history will instinctively recognize and resonate with the frequency of grace when they encounter the gospel now.
Even if their conscious memories are totally sealed.
It's like muscle memory for the soul. Deep calls unto deep.
Exactly. And this is why God uses what Wize calls the school of hard knocks.
The school of hard knocks.
Because a relationship with the Creator must be uncoerced, humanity has to organically go through tense trials on the ground in this final era. This friction, the physical limitations, the failures, the relational breakages they experience now, represents the exact same type of limitations they went through in their past life.
It's a Socratic mirror.
It is designed to exhaust their independent pride in plain sight, leading them ultimately to the Socratic therefore of faith.
Okay, this explains the adults. The people who live long enough to experience this school of hard knocks, face the friction, and make a conscious choice.
Yes.
But, and this is a big but as we established earlier, the womb pipeline is permanently shutting down. The ledger is emptying, which introduces a massive, glaring legal loophole.
The question of the vulnerable.
Yes. If this biological highway is being permanently closed off as the countdown reaches 0, what happens to a child who dies prematurely during this final era?
It's a critical question.
Because in previous eras, God might just preserve their spirit and route them back through a future womb to give them a full life trial. But if the wombs are fast closed by sovereign decree, and there are literally no more biological bodies being produced, how does God preserve justice for a child whose life is cut short today?
It is a profound Socratic dilemma. If the system-wide womb filter is deactivated, that biological routing mechanism is no longer operational.
Right.
And God cannot just skip their trial because that would violate his absolute impartiality.
So what does he do?
To resolve this without violating his own laws, God utilizes what Wize calls the Lazarus somatic reconstruction model.
The Lazarus somatic reconstruction model. Let's break down the mechanics of this because it sounds incredible.
During this final tensed era, if a youth dies before reaching the maturity required for a full trial of faith, God bypasses the closed womb filter entirely.
Okay.
He reconstructs their literal physical flesh, what the text refers to as their bazaar, directly on the current earth.
He rebuilds their bazaar.
Yes, it is a sovereign, physical raising from the dead, typologically represented by Jesus raising Lazarus from the tomb.
So he just reconstructs their physical body, their bazaar, right there on the playing field. He doesn't need a biological mother to birth them again.
Exactly.
This totally closes that massive legal loophole. If the biological highway is shut down, God doesn't just abandon those souls to an incomplete trial. He actively, miraculously steps in to ensure their trial of faith can reach a natural, uncoerced conclusion.
Exactly. And the mechanics of this reconstruction are highly specific to maintain the integrity of the trial.
How so?
When the youth is resurrected, they retain full memory of their immediate, current relational life.
Okay, so they wake up knowing their parents, their siblings, their home.
Yes. This preserves their developmental life trial on the playing field of this final era without disrupting their current timeline.
But what about the ancient memory seal? Does the shock of resurrection break the firewall?
No, not at all. The seal of forgetfulness regarding their ancient past life identity remains perfectly unbroken.
Oh, I see.
Their old soul memories are still sealed under the divine firewall, so they don't suddenly wake up with terrifying knowledge of the spiritual realm that would force their faith by sight.
They just wake up as the child their parents know, given a second chance to mature.
Yes.
And Wize points out that God doesn't just do this in a vacuum. He uses mature, spirit-led believers as the active, physical instruments of these raisings on the earth, right?
Yes. Believers who are totally led by the Holy Spirit act in absolute submission to serve as a powerful, undeniable witness.
Wow.
They become the physical instruments of this somatic reconstruction. It stands as an unadulterated testament to the truth of the sovereign's absolute power over life and death.
Okay, so let's just look at the board for a second.
Yeah.
Every single soul gets a completely fair, impartial, fully realized trial of choice.
Yes.
The adults go through the school of hard knocks. The youth who die are somatically reconstructed in their bazaar to finish their trial. The ledger is perfectly balanced.
Perfectly balanced.
Every single historical soul is accounted for. And this continues until that countdown hits absolute zero with the final processing of Adam and Eve.
And once that final terminal point is reached, once every authorized spirit has made their uncourse choice, the timeline hits midnight.
Midnight.
The legal case of human history has been fully tried and settled. There are no more names. There is no more biological runway.
Which brings us to the final global confrontation.
It does.
And here's where Wize completely deconstructs the Hollywood myth of the end times. Because usually when people think about the end of the world, they picture this massive, chaotic, cosmic bar fight.
Right, armies clashing, tanks rolling.
A huge, bloody physical battle of Gog and Magog where good and evil punch it out. But Wize says that entire physical siege is a delusion.
It is a complete delusion, orchestrated by the adversary's desperation. There is no actual physical battle.
Never at all.
No. The forces of evil are permitted to surround the camp of the saints, but they are never permitted to strike a single blow. The physical siege ends instantly. Not with a drawn-out, dramatic war, but with swift, sovereign fire from above.
So it's not a cosmic bar fight. It's an eviction notice signed by a judge. The gavel drops, the fire falls, and it's over.
That is the perfect way to frame it because it is strictly a courtroom proceeding. And this leads us to what Wize calls the sequence sabotage.
The sequence sabotage. What does he mean by that?
He aggressively refutes any theological idea that the events of the end times are out of order or that the timeline is scrambled or open to interpretation.
Oh, so he argues that God is a God of strict legal sequence. Prophetic events can't be bypassed or rearranged because each step is a legally binding courtroom transition.
Exactly. You can't skip to the verdict before presenting the evidence. The sequence must happen in strict chronological order to legally close out the old creation's wait state.
Okay, so what is that strict order?
First, the millennium. Then the little season sifting we've been discussing where the ledger runs out. Then the great white throne judgment. And finally, the lake of fire.
Let's talk about that great white throne judgment because Wize maps out this final sequence like a courtroom docket.
He does. You can see it on the great white throne slide.
It's a massive courtroom liquidation. And there are two very specific defendants here that are crucial to understand. It's not just wicked people being judged.
No.
The defendants are death itself, Thanatos, and Hades.
Yes. Wize explicitly focuses on the eradication of the jailers. Death and Hades are cast into the lake of fire.
Wow.
He emphasizes a profound physical reality here. You cannot manifest a truly deathless, curse-free, renewed Earth while the power of physical death is still mathematically operational anywhere in the cosmos.
That makes total sense.
By throwing the very power of separation death itself into the fire, the curse of decay is permanently walled off from reality.
I really need to unpack this legal concept because Wize ties this back to a specific forensic blueprint. The forensic blueprint slide highlights this. He contrasts two ancient concepts, Kafar versus Hilasmos.
Yes.
What is the difference, and why does it matter so much at this great white throne judgment?
Yeah. It is the difference between managing a debt and obliterating a debt.
Okay.
Under the old covenant system of animal sacrifices, sin was merely covered. That is the Hebrew concept of kafar.
Kafar.
Covered.
Yes, the debt was temporarily hidden, but the ledger remained open. The principal of the loan was still outstanding.
Okay, let me use a financial analogy here. Kafar is like making the absolute minimum interest payment on a massive, crushing mortgage.
Right.
The bank holds off on foreclosing for another month, so you're covered temporarily, but you still owe the bank millions of dollars. The debt hasn't gone anywhere.
Exactly. But under the new covenant, Christ offered a perfect, infinite propitiation. The Greek term is Hilasmos.
Hilasmos.
This is a total global settlement that absolutely canceled the legal debt.
So Hilasmos isn't just making the interest payment. It's someone walking into the bank with $1 billion in cash, paying off your entire mortgage, paying off everyone else's mortgage, and then legally buying the bank itself and burning the building to the ground so a debt can never be recorded again. That is a phenomenal way to describe the Great White Throne Judgment. The debt must be completely liquidated.
Burn the bank down.
Exactly. The final sequence isn't chaotic, angry destruction. It's a precise courtroom liquidation of the old creation's weight state, permanently closing the ledger.
The jurisdiction of death is legally and permanently dissolved because the debt that gave death its power has been paid in full via Hilasmos.
Right.
So with the bank burned down and death permanently liquidated, the old creation is gone. Which brings us to the ultimate question. What replaces this current Earth?
This is where we transition to the breathtaking reality of what Wize calls the renewed Earth.
The renewed Earth.
Yes. And it is vital that we completely dispel the traditional cultural myth of eternity here.
Yes, the myth of eternity as retirement.
Yeah.
Sitting on a fluffy cloud, wearing a diaper, playing a harp, frozen in this static, unchanging state of utter boredom for all eternity. Wize completely shatters that image.
He does, because it is biologically and legally inaccurate within this framework.
Right.
With death and Hades destroyed, the friction of decay entropy itself is extinct. The renewed Earth is not a static, ghostly realm. It is a boundless, vibrant, physical ecosystem.
Wize describes this boundless expansion, and here is the most surprising, counterintuitive fact of his entire framework.
What's that?
Physical births continue. The original mandate given in Genesis to be fruitful and multiply is finally and endlessly unleashed without the curse of pain or death.
Yes, it is a permanent, eternal feature of the renewed Earth.
But to understand how this endless expansion operates without contradiction, we have to understand what Wize calls the dual population order of eternity.
Let's break that down. Look at the law of ongoing graduation slide.
Yeah, because my first thought is, wait, are the resurrected saints the ones having all these babies forever? Let's break down this dual population order because it changes everything about how we view our future vocation.
Absolutely.
Group number 1, the resurrected immortals. Who are they?
The resurrected immortals are the glorified priests. These are the listeners and believers of the current Earth who were sealed, who went through the school of hard knocks and stood firm. When they transition, they are configured to a resurrected immortal template, and as Scripture explicitly states, in the resurrection, they are equal to angels.
Equal to angels.
Because of this glorified state, they no longer marry or reproduce naturally. Their calling is fundamentally different. It is permanent, administrative, shepherding, and priestly.
Okay, so if the immortal priests aren't the ones having the children, who is fulfilling the mandate to multiply across the universe? That's group number 2, the crossover generation.
Exactly. The crossover generation consists of the unindwelt natural survivors who physically cross over from the current Earth into the renewed Earth.
Wow.
They are natural humans, but they are now living in a perfectly decay-free, uncursed world where death has been liquidated.
And it is this generation and their future offspring who will continue to marry and have natural children endlessly. But wait, here's my final pushback. If they are natural humans and they don't have the indwelling Holy Spirit yet, how do they get it?
Good question.
If the memory seal is still in place for them, they don't consciously know the historical legalities of what Jesus did to purchase this perfect world for them. They are just living in a perfect ecosystem. How do they ever come to a saving faith without tasting death or hardship?
And that is exactly where the eternal vocation of the immortals comes in. This is perhaps the most beautiful concept in the entire dossier. Wize calls this the Emmaus Road of Eternity.
I love this concept. Let's unpack the Emmaus Road.
The immortal priests, the glorified believers, will walk alongside these endless new natural generations.
Like Jesus on the road to Emmaus.
Exactly. Think of the resurrected Jesus on that road, walking with the 2 disciples, quietly opening the scriptures to them, explaining the prophecies, and setting their hearts on fire before revealing himself. The glorified saints will do exactly this. They will draw near to these natural families. They will explain the ancient legal victory of King Jesus. They will shepherd them away from independent pride, and gently guide them to a voluntary, uncoerced choice of faith.
So our eternal vocation isn't retirement on a cloud. We become the permanent teaching faculty of the universe.
We do.
We endlessly guide new generations of natural humans into a relationship with the Creator. We are the stewards of their spiritual maturation.
And the moment those natural humans place their free will faith in the King, they receive the Holy Spirit.
Wow.
This triggers an instantaneous, deathless graduation. Their natural bodies are permanently transformed into immortal vehicles, joining the ranks of the immortals. They graduate without ever having to taste physical death because death no longer exists.
That is it's a stunning, massive vision of the future. A dynamic, endlessly expanding family where the older siblings constantly shepherd the younger siblings into immortality.
It's beautiful.
So let's zoom out and summarize this massive journey we've just taken through Wize's dossier. We started with the creeping, silent shutdown of the finite womb on this current Earth, driven by a mathematically finite ledger of souls.
We looked at how secular scientists are tracking the undeniable demographic plunge towards zero, while the corporate hive mind adversary spins a desperate matrix of environmental decoys like microplastics and theological deceptions to hide the reality of the sovereign clock.
We examined the profound jurisprudence of the memory seal, ensuring every soul, whether ancient king or peasant, gets an impartial Socratic trial of faith. We saw how even the youth are provided for through the miraculous Lazarus somatic reconstruction model, bypassing the closed wombs.
And we followed that strict courtroom sequence through the Great White Throne Judgment, where the debt was obliterated through Hilasmos and death itself was finally liquidated.
All leading to the infinite, boundless multiplication of the renewed earth, where the saints serve as the eternal teaching faculty on the Emmaus road. It really highlights the immense value of viewing our reality through this lens of precise, divine jurisprudence. It takes what looks like absolute chaos and environmental collapse on the news and turns it into absolute mathematical order.
It does. It reveals that the books of history are perfectly balanced. The sovereign is executing absolute justice without partiality, down to the very last authorized soul.
Which brings us back to where we started today, that perfectly functioning factory, suddenly running out of blueprints to print. If you were listening to this and your eyes have been unsealed to the reality of this biological countdown, Wize suggests you are currently living as a whistleblower in enemy territory.
You are seeing the vertical sovereign reality that the horizontal world is desperately, frantically trying to hide with noise, concrete, and pollution.
So here is a final thought to mull over. The next time you open a news app and see headlines panicking about a global reduction in birth rates, or you read long articles blaming economics, stress, and microplastics for the quietly emptying maternity wards, how will it change your perspective? How will you walk through your day knowing you aren't watching the random, tragic collapse of a biological species, but rather the perfect mathematical finality of a sovereign clock?
Join the Little Season Truth Telegram community. Get daily Socratic word studies, live table talks, and immediate updates on the legal mechanics of the Eternal Destiny Framework. We look forward to seeing you over there. Come join today. Be sure to click the link in the description or type https://tg.pe/dnbu into your browser.